Everyone feared the black prisoner, until the widow offered her wedding ring to pay his bail. If this kind of story touches your heart, like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The courtroom doors slammed open with a sound like thunder. Malcolm Hayes stepped through those doors in chains, and every person in that room felt their breath catch in their throats. 6 feet 3 inches of pure intimidation, shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, hands that looked like they could crush stone. The shackles around his wrists clinked with each step, a metallic rhythm that seemed to echo the collective heartbeat of everyone watching. But it wasn't just his size that made the air thick with fear. It was the silence. Malcolm didn't speak, didn't plead, didn't even look up. His dark eyes stayed fixed on the worn wooden floor, as if he'd already accepted whatever judgment was coming his way. The scars on his knuckles told stories no one wanted to hear, and his face, God, his face, was a mask of stone that revealed nothing and everything at once. Case number 4387. The bailiff announced, his voice shaking just enough to notice. The People versus Malcolm Hayes. A woman in the third row clutched her purse tighter. A man near the back actually stood up and moved toward the exit. The whispers started immediately, spreading like wildfire through the packed courtroom. "That's him," someone hissed. "The one who put Jimmy Martinez in the hospital. I heard he broke 3 ribs without even breathing hard. My cousin saw him knock out 2 guys outside Murphy's bar. Didn't even sweat." Each whisper made Malcolm seem bigger, more dangerous, more inhuman. But he just stood there, taking it all, shoulders straight, eyes down, waiting. Judge Patricia Hawkins had been on the bench for 22 years. She'd seen murderers and thieves, wife beaters and drug dealers. But something about Malcolm Hayes made even her pause. Maybe it was the way he stood so perfectly still, like a coiled spring. Maybe it was the way his silence seemed to fill the entire room with unspoken threats. Or maybe it was the fear she could smell coming off everyone else. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice cutting through the whispers like a knife. "You stand accused of aggravated assault, public disturbance, and resisting arrest. How do you plead?" Malcolm's lawyer, a thin man named Peterson who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, started to speak. But Malcolm raised his head for the first time, and every person in that courtroom felt their blood turn to ice. His eyes weren't angry. They weren't pleading. They weren't even particularly sad. They were empty. Completely, utterly empty. Like a man who'd given up on the world ever understanding him. "Guilty," he said, and his voice was a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. The gasps were audible. Even his lawyer looked shocked. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Hawkins said slowly, "are you sure you understand what you're—" "I understand perfectly." Malcolm's voice never changed pitch, never showed emotion. It was the voice of a man who'd already been convicted in every mind that mattered. "I did what they said I did." But that wasn't the whole truth, and somewhere in that courtroom, one person knew it. Emma Rodriguez sat in the front row, 17 years old, and trying to disappear into herself. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the wooden bench. She wanted to stand up, wanted to scream the truth, wanted to tell them all what really happened that night behind the convenience store. But she was terrified. Not of Malcolm, never of Malcolm. She was terrified of what would happen if she spoke. "The court will now consider bail," Judge Hawkins announced. "Given the defendant's criminal history and the serious nature of these charges, I'm setting bail at $10,000. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. $10,000 might as well have been $10 million for a man like Malcolm Hayes. He had no family, no friends, no one who would risk their reputation or their money on someone the whole town saw as a monster. He would sit in county jail until his trial, and everyone could sleep soundly knowing the dangerous man was locked away. That's when June Whitaker stood up. At first, no one even noticed her. June was the kind of woman who'd perfected the art of being invisible. 47 years old, with silver threading through her brown hair and her late husband's oversized coat wrapped around her small frame like armor. She'd been sitting in the back corner, so quiet that most people had forgotten she was there. But when she stood, something in the air shifted. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was soft but clear as a bell. "I'd like to post bail for Mr. Hayes." The courtroom went dead silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from surprise, but the kind that comes from shock so complete that people forget how to breathe. Judge Hawkins blinked twice, as if she couldn't quite process what she'd just heard. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitaker. Could you repeat that? I said I'd like to post bail for Mr. Hayes. June's hands were trembling, but her voice never wavered. I have the money. And then she did something that would be talked about in that town for years to come. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. The same box that had sat on her dresser for the past 2 years, untouched since the day they buried her husband. Inside was her wedding ring, a simple gold band with 3 small diamonds that had belonged to her grandmother. It was the only thing of value she owned, the only physical reminder of the 30-year marriage that had been her whole world. I'd like to use this as collateral, she said, walking toward the front of the courtroom with steps that seemed too steady for what she was doing. The whispers exploded. Has she lost her mind? What's wrong with her? That ring is worth more than he is. But June kept walking until she reached the bailiff's desk, where she set the velvet box down with a soft thud that somehow seemed louder than all the shouting. Malcolm finally looked up. For the first time since entering that courtroom, he raised his head and met someone's eyes. His gaze found June's across the sea of shocked faces, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. She wasn't looking at him with fear. She wasn't looking at him with pity. She was looking at him like he was human. Mrs. Whitaker, Judge Hawkins said carefully, I need to make sure you understand what you're doing. If Mr. Hayes fails to appear for trial, you'll forfeit that ring permanently. Are you prepared for that risk? June's fingers went to the spot on her left hand where her wedding ring used to sit. The pale band of skin was still visible after 2 years of widowhood, a ghost of the promise she'd made to love and cherish until death do them part. I understand the risk, Your Honor. And you're willing to take it? For a man you don't even know? That's when June turned around and looked at the sea of faces staring back at her. Some were shocked, some were angry, but most were just confused. They couldn't understand why their quiet, respectable neighbor would throw her life away on a stranger. But June saw something else in those faces. She saw the same blind fear and hatred that had taken her husband's kindness and turned it into something else after he died. She saw people who had decided who Malcolm was without ever asking him. She saw herself, 2 years ago, when the whole town had looked at her with pity and she'd wanted to disappear. Your Honor, she said quietly, I know exactly what I'm doing. The gavel came down like a gunshot. Bail is set. Mr. Hayes, you are remanded to the custody of Mrs. Whitaker until your court date. This court is adjourned. But the real drama was just beginning. As the courtroom emptied, the whispers turned to accusations, speculation turning to venom. June stood beside Malcolm as the bailiff removed his shackles, and she could feel the weight of every stare, every judgment, every assumption. You don't know me, Malcolm said quietly as they prepared to leave. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to her, and his voice was softer than she'd expected. You don't know what I've done. June picked up her purse and straightened her coat. No, she agreed. But I know what you didn't do. Malcolm's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in that stone mask he'd been wearing. Emma Rodriguez is my goddaughter, June said simply. And she told me what really happened that night. The story Emma had whispered through tears in June's kitchen 3 nights ago was nothing like what the police report said. Nothing like what the newspapers printed. Nothing like what the whole town believed. Emma had been walking home from her job at the movie theater when she noticed the man following her. At first, she thought it was coincidence, same direction, same pace. But when she turned down the alley behind the convenience store to take her usual shortcut, he turned too. And when she started running, he started running. Malcolm Hayes had been walking home from his dishwashing job at Murphy's Bar when he heard the scream. He'd turned the corner to find Emma backed against a brick wall, a man twice her size pressing close while she begged him to leave her alone. Malcolm didn't ask questions. He didn't stop to think about consequences or police reports or what people would say. He just moved. The man outweighed Emma by 100 pounds, but Malcolm outweighed him by 50. The fight was over in seconds. One solid punch that sent Emma's attacker stumbling backward, another that dropped him to the ground. But by the time the police arrived, responding to reports of screaming, the story had already changed. The man Malcolm had fought was Jerry Kaufman, son of the bank president, home from college and 3 sheets to the wind. When the police found him with a bloody nose and a rapidly swelling eye, Jerry spun a tale about being jumped by that crazy black guy for no reason. Emma tried to tell the truth. She really did. But Jerry's father had connections, money, influence. And Malcolm Hayes was just another ex-con with a record, Another black man the system was ready to believe the worst about. So Emma's testimony got buried under paperwork and lost in translation. Jerry's story became the official version. And Malcolm, who had never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it, found himself back in handcuffs. She was too scared to testify, June said as they walked through the courthouse doors together. But she told me everything. You saved her life. Malcolm was quiet for a long moment as they stepped into the afternoon sunlight. Behind them, the courthouse steps were filling with people who'd come to watch the spectacle, their voices rising in indignation. Look at that, someone called out. The widow and the criminal. What would her husband think? She's lost her damn mind. Another voice added. That monster's going to kill her in her sleep. Give it a week, a woman laughed cruelly. She'll be begging us to help her. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but June just kept walking. She'd lived in this town for 15 years, had buried her husband here, had thought these people were her friends. Now she was learning who they really were. Mrs. Whitaker, Malcolm said when they reached her car, a 10-year-old Honda that had seen better days. You don't have to do this. I can find somewhere else to stay. Where? June asked simply. Who else in this town would take you in? Malcolm didn't have an answer for that, because they both knew the truth. He had no one. No family. No friends. No connections. The few people who might have helped him were too scared of public opinion to risk it. Besides, June added, unlocking the car door, I could use the company. That house gets awfully quiet. They drove through town in silence, past the elementary school where June used to volunteer, past the diner where she and her husband used to have breakfast every Sunday, past the fire station where he'd worked for 20 years before the heart attack took him. Every person they passed stopped and stared. Some pointed. Some whispered to their companions. Some just watched with the kind of fascination people have for car accidents. June's house sat at the end of Pine Street, a small blue cottage with white trim and a garden that was just starting to bloom with spring flowers. It was the kind of house that looked like it belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting, all American dreams and white picket fences. It was also, Malcolm realized as they pulled into the driveway, completely isolated. The nearest neighbor was 300 yards away, and the house backed up to 40 acres of woods. If someone wanted to hurt June Whitaker for what she'd done today, no one would hear her scream. Are you sure about this? Malcolm asked one more time as June led him up the front steps. People in this town, they're angry. They might. His words were cut off by the sound of shattering glass. A rock the size of a baseball crashed through the front window, landing on June's living room floor in a shower of glittering shards. Attached to it was a note written in angry red letters. Send the animal back where he belongs. June stared at the broken window for a long moment, then walked calmly to the closet and pulled out a broom and dustpan. Well, she said, starting to sweep up the glass. I guess we know how they feel about our arrangement. Malcolm watched her clean up the mess with the same calm efficiency she might use to clean up spilled coffee. No tears, no panic, no second thoughts about the choice she'd made. Aren't you scared? He asked. June paused in her sweeping and looked up at him. In the afternoon light streaming through the broken window, she looked smaller, more fragile than she had in the courtroom. But her eyes held something Malcolm hadn't expected to see. Steele. Mr. Hayes, she said quietly, I've been scared every day for the past 2 years. Scared of being alone, scared of what people think, scared of a future that looks nothing like the life I planned. But you know what I'm more scared of than anything else? What's that? I'm scared of becoming the kind of person who walks past someone in trouble because it's easier than doing what's right. That night, as June cooked dinner and Malcolm sat awkwardly at her kitchen table, they could hear the cars driving slowly past the house. Some honked. Some slowed down to shout obscenities. One group of teenagers threw more rocks, hitting the side of the house with sharp cracks that made June flinch. Malcolm stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. I should check the locks, he said, his voice tight with something that might have been guilt. June watched him move through her house like a man preparing for siege. He tested the front door, the back door, every window that could be opened from outside. His movements were economical, practiced, the behavior of someone who'd learned to be cautious the hard way. You've done this before, she observed. Malcolm's hands stilled on the window latch he'd been checking. Yeah, I have. Do you want to tell me about it? For a moment, she thought he might actually open up. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he turned to face her with something that looked almost like relief. But then another car drove by, honking long and loud, and the moment passed. "No," he said quietly. "You don't need to hear that story." But June was beginning to understand that Malcolm Hayes was full of stories nobody wanted to hear. Stories about growing up in foster homes where bigger kids took what they wanted. Stories about learning to fight not because he was violent, but because violence was the only language some people understood. Stories about a criminal justice system that saw his size and his color and decided who he was before he ever opened his mouth. She was also beginning to understand that she was the first person in a long time who'd bothered to ask. Over the next 3 days, the harassment escalated. Someone spray-painted "Traitor" across June's mailbox in dripping red letters. Her tires were slashed twice. The phone rang at all hours, sometimes heavy breathing, sometimes cursing, sometimes just dial tones that suggested people calling just to make sure she was still alive. The worst part wasn't the vandalism or the threats. The worst part was the silence from people she'd thought were friends. Margaret Shun, who'd been June's closest friend since she'd moved to town, crossed the street to avoid walking past her house. Pastor Williams, who delivered her husband's eulogy, suddenly had no time to chat when she ran into him at the grocery store. Even Dr. Peterson, who'd been treating her husband for years, seemed uncomfortable when she came in for her annual checkup. It was like the whole town had decided she was contagious. But Malcolm noticed something else, something that made his jaw clench every time he looked out the window. Emma Rodriguez drove by the house at least twice a day. She never stopped, never waved, never acknowledged that she could see Malcolm standing at the window. But she was there, circling like a satellite, and her expression behind the wheel was pure torment. "She blames herself," June said one afternoon, catching Malcolm at the window again. "She thinks this is all her fault." "It's not her fault," Malcolm replied, his voice hard. "None of this is her fault. You should talk to her." Malcolm turned away from the window with a bitter laugh. "Right? Because a 17-year-old girl definitely wants to be seen talking to me right now. That would really help her reputation." June set down the dish towel she'd been using and gave him a look that would have stopped traffic. "You know what I think, Mr. Hayes?" "What's that?" "I think you're using everyone else's fear as an excuse to keep yourself locked up. You've been in prison so long. Real prison, emotional prison, doesn't matter. That you don't remember how to live any other way." The words hit Malcolm like a physical blow. He'd been called a lot of things in his 34 years: monster, animal, criminal, thug. But nobody had ever called him a coward. Nobody had ever been brave enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, he was choosing to be alone. That night, Malcolm couldn't sleep. He'd been staying in June's guest room, a small space decorated with family photos and the kind of furniture that had been loved for decades. It should have been comfortable. The bed was soft, the room was warm, and for the first time in months, he wasn't listening for trouble through steel bars. But comfort, Malcolm was learning, could be its own kind of prison. He kept thinking about what June had said, about Emma circling the house like a lost soul, about the way the girl's hands had shaken during his trial, the way she tried to speak and been silenced by lawyers and fear and a system that didn't want to hear her truth. Around midnight, he got up and walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. June was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a photo album spread out in front of her. "Can't sleep either?" she asked without looking up. Malcolm poured himself water from the tap and sat down across from her. The photo album was filled with pictures of her life with her husband. Weddings, vacations, quiet moments that had probably seemed ordinary at the time, but now looked precious. "Tell me about him," Malcolm said. June's fingers traced the edge of a photo showing her and a bearded man in firefighter's gear, both of them grinning at the camera. "David? He was good. Really good. The kind of person who'd stop traffic to help a cat out of a tree, you know? He used to say that being a firefighter wasn't just about putting out fires. It was about showing up when people needed help, even when they couldn't ask for it." "Sounds like where you got your rescue complex." June laughed, a sound that was equal parts amusement and sadness. "Maybe. Or maybe I just learned from him that sometimes doing the right thing means people will hate you for it." People hated him. Not everyone, but some. June turned the page to show a newspaper clipping, a story about a fire at a local apartment building. This happened about 5 years ago. David went into a burning building to save a family, including a little girl. They were undocumented immigrants, and there were people in town who thought he should have left them there. said he wasted taxpayer resources on people who didn't belong here. Malcolm studied the photo accompanying the article. David Whitaker looked exactly like the kind of man who would run into a burning building without hesitation, solid, determined, unafraid. What did he do? He kept doing his job, kept saving people, kept believing that everybody deserves help when they need it, regardless of what other people think. June's voice got softer. He used to say that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing what's right anyway. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, looking through the photos. Malcolm found himself studying David Whitaker's face, trying to understand what kind of man could inspire that kind of loyalty, that kind of love. He would have liked you, June said suddenly. How can you know that? Because he had a soft spot for people everybody else had given up on. Strays, you know? Both the animal kind and the human kind. She smiled at a memory Malcolm couldn't see. He always said the difference between a hero and a villain was usually just one person believing in them at the right time. And you think I'm a hero? June closed the photo album and looked at him directly. I think you're a man who risked his life to save a 17-year-old girl from being assaulted, and instead of being thanked for it, you're sitting in my kitchen at midnight because the whole town wants to see you burn. That doesn't make me a hero. That just makes me stupid. Does it? June leaned forward, her eyes intense. Because from where I sit, it makes you exactly the kind of person this town needs more of. The kind of person who acts when action is needed, consequences be damned. Outside, another car drove by slowly, engine growling in the darkness. Malcolm tensed automatically, but June didn't even look toward the window. You're not afraid, he observed. Of course I'm afraid. But I'm more angry than afraid, and that makes all the difference. Angry at who? Everyone. The word came out with surprising force. I'm angry at the police for not listening to Emma. I'm angry at this town for deciding who you are based on rumors and prejudice. I'm angry at Jerry Kaufman for being a coward and letting you take the blame for his crimes. And I'm angry at myself for waiting so long to do something about it. Malcolm studied her face in the dim kitchen light. June Whitaker looked like anyone's grandmother. Soft features, gentle hands. The kind of woman who probably baked cookies for church fundraisers. But underneath that exterior was something harder, something that wouldn't bend. Your husband really would have liked me? He asked. June smiled. And for the first time since he'd met her, it reached all the way to her eyes. Mr. Hayes, he would have driven to that courthouse himself to bail you out. And then he would have invited you to stay for dinner. The next morning, everything changed. Malcolm woke to the sound of sirens. Not the distant wail of emergency vehicles heading somewhere else, but the close, urgent scream of trouble coming their way. He was out of bed and looking through the window before he was fully awake, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Fire. The old Miller barn at the edge of town was completely engulfed, flames shooting 50 feet into the air and spreading toward the trees. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the direction the wind was blowing. Straight toward the residential district. Straight toward houses full of sleeping families. Malcolm was pulling on his clothes when June appeared in the hallway, already dressed and moving with purpose. The fire department's 20 minutes out, she said, checking her phone. The nearest truck is in Coopers Falls dealing with a car accident. What about the volunteer department? 3 men and equipment from 1987. They won't be able to handle something this big. Through the window, they could see smoke beginning to drift across Pine Street. In the distance, porch lights were coming on as people woke up and smelled danger in the air. Malcolm finished tying his boots and grabbed his jacket. I'm going to help. Malcolm, no. June caught his arm as he headed for the door. You can't. Not now. Not with everything that's happened. They'll think. They'll think I'm trying to help save their damn houses, Malcolm said firmly. And maybe, just maybe, they'll figure out that's more important than whatever they think they know about me. He was out the door before June could argue further. The scene at the Miller barn was chaos. The old structure was a complete loss. Nothing but a skeleton of burning timber and a pillar of smoke that could be seen for miles. But the real problem was what lay beyond it. The fire had jumped to the dry grass, and with the wind pushing it along, it was heading straight for the edge of town where newer houses sat on large lots with plenty of trees and brush to fuel the flames. A dozen men were already there with garden hoses and buckets, but they might as well have been spitting at the sun. The fire was moving faster than they could contain it, and every minute of delay meant more homes in danger. Malcolm arrived just as Bill Henderson, who owned the hardware store, was shouting into his phone at the county fire department. "I don't care about protocols. We need help now. The whole east side of town is going to burn." When Bill saw Malcolm approaching, his face went white, then red with fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded. "I came to help," Malcolm said simply. "Help?" Bill laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "The last thing we need is—" He was cut off by the sound of splintering wood as a burning tree crashed down across Pine Street, blocking the road and trapping two houses between the fire and any chance of escape. That's when they heard the screaming. Mrs. Patterson, who was 84 and walked with a cane, was trapped in her house on the wrong side of the fallen tree. The fire was less than 100 yards away and moving fast, and there was no way for the fire department to reach her even if they arrived in the next few minutes. "Someone has to go get her," Bill said, but his voice was shaking. The men looked at each other, then at the wall of flames advancing through the trees. It would mean running toward the fire, not away from it. It would mean risking everything for one old woman who might not even be able to move fast enough to escape. It would mean being a hero when being a coward was so much safer. Malcolm was moving before anyone else had time to think. He vaulted over the fallen tree and sprinted toward Mrs. Patterson's house, ignoring the shouts behind him. The heat hit him like a physical force when he got within 50 yards of the flames, and the smoke was thick enough to choke on. But he kept running. Mrs. Patterson's front door was unlocked, a small-town habit that might just save her life. Malcolm found her in the kitchen, trying to gather photo albums and important papers with hands that shook too much to be effective. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, and she looked up with eyes wide with fear. "We need to go? Now." For a moment, he thought she might refuse, might be too afraid of him to accept help from the dangerous man the whole town had been talking about. But then she looked past him toward the orange glow filling her windows and made the calculation that mattered. "My cats," she said. "I can't leave my cats." Malcolm looked around the small house and spotted two terrified animals hiding under the kitchen table. He scooped them up, one under each arm, while Mrs. Patterson grabbed her purse. "Hold on to me," he told her, and together they made their way back toward the door. The fire had advanced while they were inside. What had been 100 yards away was now 50, then 30, then close enough that Malcolm could feel his skin starting to burn. They made it to the fallen tree just as a group of men arrived to help pull them to safety. But as Mrs. Patterson was lifted over the trunk, one of her cats panicked and clawed its way out of Malcolm's grip, bolting back toward the house. "Whiskers!" Mrs. Patterson screamed. "Please, someone get Whiskers." The cat had disappeared into the smoke, probably hiding under the porch or in the basement. To find it would mean going back into a house that was now surrounded by fire on 3 sides. It would mean risking everything for a cat. Malcolm looked at the faces of the men around him. Bill Henderson, Tom Murphy, Jim Collins, all the people who'd spent the last week calling him an animal. They were looking at the burning house, then at him, waiting to see what the monster would do. Without a word, Malcolm turned around and ran back toward the flames. The house was an oven by the time he got back inside. The smoke was so thick he could barely see his own hands, and the heat was intense enough to make him dizzy. But he could hear the cat yowling somewhere in the back of the house. He found Whiskers in the bathroom, hiding behind the toilet and too scared to move. Malcolm grabbed the terrified animal, wrapped it in a towel from the rack, and turned to leave. That's when he heard the sound every firefighter dreads, the groan and crack of a roof about to collapse. Malcolm threw himself toward the front door as the ceiling came down behind him in a shower of sparks and burning wood. He rolled down the front steps and kept rolling until strong hands grabbed him and dragged him away from the inferno that had been Mrs. Patterson's house. When he finally stopped coughing long enough to look up, he found himself surrounded by the same men who'd been throwing rocks at June's house just days before. But now they weren't looking at him with hatred or fear. They were looking at him with something that might have been respect. Bill Henderson was the first to speak. "You could have died in there." Malcolm looked down at the cat in his arms, then over at Mrs. Patterson, who was crying with relief and reaching for her pet. "Yeah," he said simply. "I could have." "Why?" Tom Murphy asked. "Why risk your life for a cat?" Malcolm stood up slowly, his clothes singed and his face streaked with soot. Around him, the fire continued to burn, but the wind was dying down and the real firefighters would be there soon. The immediate crisis was over. But the bigger crisis, the one that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with fear, was just beginning to resolve. Because Mrs. Patterson asked me to, Malcolm said. Because that cat mattered to someone. Because when you see something that needs doing, you do it. He looked around at the faces surrounding him. Faces that belonged to men who'd been ready to believe the worst about him without ever asking for his side of the story. Just like you all just did, he added. You saw someone in trouble, and you helped. That's what people do. That's what neighbors do. The silence that followed wasn't the hostile, quiet Malcolm had grown used to. It was the silence of people reconsidering everything they thought they knew. That's when Emma Rodriguez came running around the corner. She'd been watching the fire from her bedroom window, had seen Malcolm run into the burning house not once but twice. She'd watched him risk his life for people who'd spent a week calling him a monster, and something inside her finally broke. "Stop it," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "All of you, just stop it." The men turned to stare at her, surprised by the outburst from the quiet teenager who'd been at the center of the whole mess. "He saved me," Emma sobbed, pointing at Malcolm. That night behind the convenience store, Jerry Kaufman was he was going to. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. And Malcolm stopped him. "He saved me, and you all called him a criminal." The confession hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. These were men who had daughters, granddaughters, nieces. The thought of what might have happened to Emma if Malcolm hadn't been there made them sick. Jerry said. Bill Henderson started to say. Jerry lied. Emma's voice cracked with emotion. He lied because he was drunk and scared and his daddy has money. And you all believed him because it was easier than admitting that maybe, just maybe, you don't know everything about everybody. She looked around at the circle of men, her young face fierce with righteous anger. "Malcolm Hayes is not a monster," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. "He's the bravest person I know. And if you can't see that after what just happened, then you're all blind." The sound of approaching sirens filled the awkward silence that followed. The real fire department was finally arriving, along with police cars and an ambulance to check on Mrs. Patterson and anyone else who might have been injured. But the most important rescue had already taken place. As the professional firefighters took over the scene and the crowd began to disperse, Bill Henderson approached Malcolm with hesitant steps. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice rough with smoke and shame. "We all do." Malcolm looked at the man who'd been leading the charge against him just hours before. Bill's face was streaked with soot, his hair singed from getting too close to the flames while trying to help. He looked older somehow, diminished by the weight of his own prejudice. "You don't owe me anything," Malcolm said quietly. "Yes, I do." Bill's voice got stronger, more determined. "I spent the last week calling you names, throwing rocks at June's house, telling anyone who'd listen that you were dangerous. And tonight you risked your life to save my neighbor's cat." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "I was wrong," he said finally. "About everything. And I'm sorry." One by one, the other men approached. Tom Murphy, who owned the gas station. Jim Collins, who ran the auto repair shop. Dave Martinez, Jimmy's older brother, the same Jimmy who was supposedly in the hospital because of Malcolm's violence. Each man offered his own version of the same apology. Each one carried the weight of assumptions made and judgments passed without evidence. But it was Dave Martinez whose apology hit the hardest. "My brother lied," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jimmy was never in the hospital because of you. He was in the hospital because he got drunk and fell down his own stairs 3 days after you were arrested. But everyone was so ready to believe the worst about you that we let them think what they wanted to think." Malcolm felt something cold settle in his chest. "You let me go to jail for something that never happened?" "We didn't think it mattered," Dave said, shame coloring his voice. "You were guilty of the assault on Jerry Kaufman anyway, right? What difference did it make if people thought you'd hurt Jimmy too?" "The difference," Malcolm said with quiet intensity, "is that lies have a way of becoming truth when enough people repeat them. The difference is that reputation is all some people have, and you helped destroy mine for no reason at all." Dave Martinez looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Around them, the other men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own complicity in the character assassination that had followed Malcolm's arrest. "How do we fix this?" Bill Henderson asked. Malcolm looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that now showed regret instead of hatred, shame instead of fear. "A week ago, These same men had been ready to run him out of town. Now they were asking for his forgiveness. "You start by telling the truth," he said simply. "All of it. To everyone who'll listen." The next morning brought changes that felt like a different world entirely. Malcolm woke to the sound of knocking on June's front door, not the angry pounding they'd grown accustomed to, but a polite, hesitant tapping. When June answered it, she found Margaret Chin standing on the front porch with a covered dish and tears in her eyes. "I brought casserole," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion, "and an apology that's about a week overdue." Behind her stood a small group of women, neighbors who'd crossed the street to avoid June just days before, friends who'd turned their backs when she needed them most. Each one carried something: food, flowers, handwritten notes of apology. "We heard what happened last night," said Sarah Williams, the pastor's wife. "What Malcolm did at the fire. And Emma finally told us what really happened that night behind the store." June looked out at the group of women who'd been her social circle before she'd committed the unforgivable sin of showing compassion to the wrong person. Part of her wanted to slam the door in their faces, to make them feel the same isolation they'd subjected her to. But as she looked at their faces, really looked, she saw something that made her pause. They weren't just sorry for misjudging Malcolm. They were horrified by what they discovered about themselves. "Come in," June said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Malcolm, we have visitors." The next hour was unlike anything Malcolm had ever experienced. These women, most of whom had never spoken to a black man for longer than it took to order coffee, sat in June's living room and asked him about his life. Real questions, personal questions, questions that treated him like a human being instead of a cautionary tale. They learned that he'd grown up in foster care after his mother died of cancer when he was 8. That he'd been in and out of juvenile facilities not because he was violent, but because running away from abusive homes was technically a crime. That his first adult conviction had been for stealing food when he was 18 and homeless. They learned that he'd served his time, worked to better himself, held down jobs, and tried to stay invisible because invisible felt safer than being seen as a threat. Most importantly, they learned that every assumption they'd made about him was wrong. "I don't understand," Margaret Chin said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "If Emma knew the truth, why didn't she speak up sooner? Why let you suffer like this?" Malcolm's expression softened as he thought about the 17-year-old girl who'd been carrying the weight of his wrongful imprisonment on her shoulders. "Because she's a kid," he said simply. "Because Jerry Kaufman's father has power and money, and kids that age know better than to go up against people like that alone. Because the system wasn't set up to listen to her in the first place." "But that's not fair," Sarah Williams protested. "No," Malcolm agreed. "It's not. But fairness is a luxury some people can't afford. Emma did what she had to do to survive, and I don't blame her for that." The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time it was Bill Henderson, hat in hand, and looking like a man who'd spent the night wrestling with his conscience. "Malcolm," he said, "I wondered if I could have a word with you." They stepped outside onto the front porch, where the morning sun was burning off the last of the smoke from the previous night's fire. In the distance, they could see the blackened remains of the Miller barn and the surrounding trees, but the residential area had been saved. "I talked to the police this morning," Bill said without preamble. "About Jerry Kaufman. About what really happened that night." Malcolm felt his heart skip a beat. And they're reopening the case. Jerry's story is falling apart now that people are asking the right questions, and there's a convenience store camera that nobody bothered to check the first time around. Bill paused, looking out at the town he'd lived in his entire life. "There's going to be charges," he continued, "against Jerry for what he tried to do to Emma. And there's going to be questions about why the investigation was handled so poorly the first time. What does that mean for me? It means your charges are going to be dropped. It means you're going to get a public apology from the mayor, the police chief, and anyone else with half a brain in this town. And it means Jerry Kaufman is going to face the consequences he should have faced a week ago." Malcolm leaned against the porch railing, trying to process what he was hearing. After a lifetime of being presumed guilty, the idea of official vindication felt almost surreal. "There's something else," Bill added. "The town council met this morning. Emergency session. We want to offer you something." "What kind of something?" "A job. Official position with the fire department. Emergency response coordinator. It comes with training, benefits, and a salary that reflects the kind of courage you showed last night." Malcolm stared at him. You're offering me a job? After everything that's happened? We're offering you a career, Bill corrected. Because last night proved something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Character isn't about what people say about you. It's about what you do when it matters. The offer was generous. More than generous, it was life-changing. But Malcolm had learned to be cautious about gifts that seemed too good to be true. What's the catch? Bill smiled ruefully. The catch is that you'd have to stay in a town full of people who spent the last week proving they don't deserve you. The catch is that some folks are going to take a long time to come around, and some might never come around at all. And you think I should take it anyway? I think, Bill said carefully, that this town needs people who do the right thing even when it's hard. I think we need people who run toward trouble instead of away from it. And I think maybe, if you're willing to forgive us, we can do better. Before Malcolm could respond, another car pulled up in front of the house. This time it was Judge Patricia Hawkins, still in her robes from the morning session. Mr. Hayes, she called from her car window. Could you come down to the courthouse? There's something we need to take care of. An hour later, Malcolm stood in the same courtroom where he'd been branded a criminal just 1 week before. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. The gallery was packed, but instead of hostile stares, he saw faces filled with shame, regret, and something that looked like hope. Emma Rodriguez sat in the front row with her parents, her hands folded tightly in her lap, but her chin raised with newfound courage. June sat beside her, and next to June was the small velvet box that had started this entire journey. This court owes you an apology, Mr. Hayes, Judge Hawkins began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. The system failed you in ways that are both inexcusable and all too common. Justice delayed is justice denied, and in your case, justice was nearly denied permanently. She looked out at the crowd, her expression stern. But this community failed you in ways that go beyond the legal system. You were judged not by your actions, but by assumptions. You were condemned not by evidence, but by prejudice. And you were punished not for what you did, but for who people decided you were. The judge's gaze returned to Malcolm. The charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. The record will reflect that you acted in defense of another person, that your actions were both necessary and heroic, and that this court deeply regrets the injustice you have suffered. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. Mr. Hayes, you have every right to walk out of this courtroom, leave this town, and never look back. No one here would blame you for that choice. Malcolm looked out at the sea of faces watching him. He saw Bill Henderson and the other men who'd apologized at the fire scene. He saw Margaret Chun and the women who'd brought casserole and tears to June's house. He saw Emma Rodriguez, who'd finally found the courage to tell her truth. And he saw June Whitaker, the woman who'd risked everything on a stranger because she believed in doing what was right. Your Honor, Malcolm said, his voice steady and clear, I appreciate the apology. I appreciate the acknowledgement of what went wrong. But I don't think leaving is the answer. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. This town made mistakes, Malcolm continued. But last night, when it mattered most, the people here showed me who they really are underneath all the fear and assumptions. They showed me that people can change, that communities can grow, that doing the right thing still matters. He looked directly at Judge Hawkins. I'd like to stay, Your Honor. I'd like to help this town become the place it has the potential to be. And I'd like to accept the job offer the fire department made this morning. The applause started slowly, just a few people at first, then building to a crescendo that filled the entire courtroom. But the sound Malcolm heard most clearly was the quiet sob of relief from Emma Rodriguez, who'd been carrying the weight of his imprisonment for a week too long. Judge Hawkins gavelled for order, but she was smiling as she did it. In that case, Mr. Hayes, I have one more order of business. She nodded to the bailiff, who approached June with her small velvet box. Mrs. Whitaker, this belongs to you. June opened the box with trembling fingers, revealing the wedding ring that had started everything. 3 small diamonds caught the courthouse lights, throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. But instead of immediately putting the ring back on her finger, June stood up and walked over to where Malcolm was standing. Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet courtroom, would you do me the honor? Malcolm looked confused for a moment, then understood. With gentle hands, he took the ring from the box and slipped it back onto June's left hand, where it belonged. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Thank you, he replied. For seeing me when everyone else saw a monster. The courtroom erupted in applause again, but this time it felt different. It felt like celebration instead of obligation, like joy instead of relief. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Malcolm and June found themselves surrounded by people who wanted to shake hands, offer jobs, invite them to dinner, and generally make up for a week's worth of terrible behavior. But the moment that mattered most came when they reached the courthouse steps. Emma Rodriguez was waiting there, away from the crowd, her parents standing supportively behind her. "Malcolm," she said, and her voice was steady for the first time since he'd met her. "I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner." "You don't need to apologize," Malcolm said firmly. "You found your courage when it mattered most. That's all anyone can ask." "I was scared," Emma admitted. "Of Jerry's family, of what people would think, of making everything worse." "Being scared doesn't make you a coward," Malcolm replied. "It makes you human. Being scared and doing the right thing anyway. That's what makes you brave." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She hugged him. It was a quick hug, the kind a daughter might give her father after a long separation. But it was also a public declaration that she wasn't ashamed to be associated with the man who'd saved her life. The crowd that had gathered on the courthouse steps fell silent, watching this moment of connection between the victim and her rescuer, the girl who'd been silenced and the man who'd paid the price for her silence. "You saved my life," Emma said when she stepped back. "Twice. Once from Jerry, and once from the guilt of not speaking up for you." "We saved each other," Malcolm replied. "That's what people do." 6 months later, the town looked almost exactly the same as it had before Malcolm Hayes walked into that courtroom in chains. The same main street, the same shops, the same houses with their same white picket fences and American dreams. But the people living in those houses had changed in ways that went deeper than the surface. Malcolm had become not just accepted, but beloved. His work with the fire department had earned him respect throughout the county, and his quiet dedication to helping others had made him a pillar of the community. He'd never married, never had children, but somehow he'd become everyone's brother, everyone's friend, everyone's proof that people could change and grow and become better than they were. June had become something she'd never expected to be, a local hero. Her willingness to risk everything for a stranger had inspired others to examine their own prejudices and assumptions. She'd started a community organization dedicated to supporting people re-entering society after incarceration, and her small house on Pine Street had become an unofficial counseling center for anyone who needed someone to listen. Emma Rodriguez had graduated valedictorian of her high school class and earned a full scholarship to study criminal justice. She wanted to become a prosecutor, she said, to make sure that the system worked better for people like Malcolm. And Jerry Kaufman? He'd been convicted of attempted sexual assault and sentenced to 2 years in prison. His father's money and influence hadn't been enough to overcome the convenience store camera footage that clearly showed him following Emma into that alley with predatory intent. But perhaps the most significant change was harder to quantify. The town had learned something about itself that week. Something about the difference between safety and fear, between caution and prejudice, between protecting your community and destroying it with suspicion. They'd learned that monsters are usually just people who've been treated like monsters for so long they've forgotten how to be anything else. They'd learned that heroes come in all colors and sizes, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is risk your own reputation to stand up for someone else. Most importantly, they'd learned that redemption isn't just for the people who've made mistakes. It's for the communities that learn to forgive them. On the anniversary of that first courthouse appearance, the town held a ceremony to officially name Malcolm Hayes as their Citizen of the Year. It was a small-town affair, with a high school marching band, speeches from local politicians, and a barbecue in the town square. Malcolm stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces that had once looked at him with fear and hatred. Now they looked at him with respect, affection, and something that might have been love. "A year ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the warm afternoon air, "I stood in a courtroom convinced that this town would never see me as anything more than a criminal. I was angry about that, bitter, ready to write all of you off as hopeless." He paused, his eyes finding June in the crowd, then Emma, then the faces of men who'd thrown rocks at windows and women who'd crossed streets to avoid him. But someone in this crowd taught me something important. She taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway. She taught me that sometimes one person believing in you is enough to change everything. He looked directly at June, who was wiping tears from her eyes. June Whitaker saved my life when she offered her wedding ring for my bail. But she saved something else too. She saved my faith in humanity. She saved my belief that people can change, that communities can grow, that doing the right thing still matters. The applause was thunderous, but Malcolm raised his hand for quiet. I want to challenge all of you to be that person for someone else. To be the one who looks past the surface and sees the human being underneath. To be the one who takes a risk on a stranger because it's the right thing to do. He smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. Because you never know, that stranger might just surprise you. As the ceremony ended and people began to mingle and celebrate, Malcolm found himself standing next to the memorial statue in the town square. It was dedicated to local heroes, firefighters, police officers, military veterans who'd served their community with distinction. June appeared beside him, following his gaze to the bronze names etched in stone. "Thinking about David?" she asked. Malcolm nodded, thinking about what he would have made of all this. June slipped her arm through his, a gesture that had become natural over the months of friendship they'd built. He would have been proud. Of you, of the town, of the way people came together after they realized what really mattered. And what's that? June looked around at the celebration surrounding them. Children playing, families laughing, former enemies sharing barbecue and stories. That we're all just people, she said simply. Scared, flawed, imperfect people trying to do better than we did yesterday. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, someone gives us the chance to prove it. Malcolm squeezed her arm gently. Thank you, June, for giving me that chance. Thank you, she replied, for taking it. As the sun set over the small town that had learned to see past its own fears, Malcolm Hayes stood surrounded by people who'd once called him a monster and now called him family. The wedding ring on June's finger caught the golden light, 3 small diamonds throwing rainbows across the evening sky. It was, he thought, exactly the kind of ending David Whitaker would have written. The kind where everybody gets to go home. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.